Welcome to Future Epoch, where we learn more about our world. In October 1964, a train pulled out of Tokyo Station and arrived in Osaka 2 hours and 30 minutes later. It had covered over 500 kilometers. Nothing had ever moved that many people that fast on land before. The Shinkansen was not just a railway. It was a statement about what modern infrastructure could accomplish, and it opened to the public on the same day the Tokyo Olympics began. More than 60 years later, the world's high-speed rail network has expanded to over 60,000 kilometers of dedicated track across dozens of countries. Yet enormous stretches of the developed world have none of it. The United States, with the world's largest economy, does not have a single true high-speed rail line in operation. Britain's flagship expansion project is being quietly dismantled before it is even finished. The question worth asking is not whether high-speed rail works. The evidence on that is clear. The real question is why building it remains so difficult for so many countries. High-speed rail is generally defined as passenger rail operating above 200 km per hour on dedicated tracks, though some systems use upgraded conventional lines for portions of their routes. The defining characteristic is not merely speed, but the separation from freight and slower passenger services, which is what allows the consistent scheduling and high frequencies that make HSR genuinely competitive with air travel. On routes between roughly 150 and 800 kilometers, high-speed rail is consistently faster than flying when door-to-door time is considered. There is no security queue, no baggage carousel, no 45-minute drive to an airport on the edge of the city. The train departs from the city center and arrives at the city center. At those distances, the train wins. It also produces a fraction of the carbon emissions of a comparable flight, operates in almost any weather, and can carry several times as many passengers per hour as a motorway lane. The engineering case for it is, by most measures, straightforward. The Shinkansen launched the era, but Europe followed within 2 decades. France opened its first TGV line between Paris and Lyon in 1981, cutting journey times dramatically and pulling millions of passengers off domestic flights. The commercial success was immediate. Spain followed in 1992, connecting Madrid and Seville in time for the Expo. Germany launched its ICE network the same year, and Italy, Belgium, South Korea, and the Netherlands all built systems in the years that followed. But none of these networks compared to what China did next. In 2007, China opened its first high-speed services on upgraded conventional lines. By 2008, it had its first dedicated high-speed corridor connecting Beijing and Tianjin. What followed was one of the largest infrastructure construction programs in human history. China built roughly 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in under 15 years, connecting nearly every major city in the country. Trains now run from Beijing to Shanghai in under 5 hours, and the network carries well over 2 billion passenger journeys per year. That speed of construction was made possible by a combination of centralized political decision-making, enormous state investment, land acquisition processes that would be legally impossible in most democracies, and an industrial base that had learned to produce the necessary components at extraordinary scale. The result is a network that, by the mid-2020s, accounted for more than 2/3 of all high-speed rail track on Earth. The contrast between China's expansion and the experience of the Western democracies reveals the central tension at the heart of global high-speed rail development. It is not a technical problem. The engineering is solved. It is a political and financial problem, and it is one that has so far defeated some of the wealthiest nations on Earth. High-speed rail requires enormous upfront capital. A kilometer of new dedicated high-speed track in Europe typically costs between 20 and 40 million euros, and that figure climbs sharply in urban areas, mountainous terrain, or places with complex land ownership. The benefits of that investment are real, but they are spread across decades, across many stakeholders, and they are diffuse enough that no single private entity will fund it alone. Britain's HS2 project illustrates the problem in precise and painful detail. Originally conceived as a Y-shaped network connecting London to Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds, the project was announced in 2009 with an estimated cost of around £30 billion. By 2023, the government had cancelled the northern legs of the route entirely, leaving only a truncated line between London and Birmingham that would not even reach the original city centre terminus. The estimated cost by that point had risen to figures exceeding £100 billion for a project delivering a fraction of the originally promised connectivity. Supporters argued the case for the full network remained sound and that political failure, not conceptual failure, was responsible. Critics argued the original projections were unrealistic from the outset and that the money could have been better spent modernizing the existing network. The United States tells a comparable story, scaled to an even more fragmented political landscape. Amtrak's Acela service on the Northeast Corridor is frequently described as high-speed rail, but it averages around 110 km per hour across its full route because it shares tracks with freight trains and conventional passenger services. California's high-speed rail project, approved by voters in 2008 with a budget of $33 billion, had grown to an estimated $128 billion by the early 2020s, with only a segment in the Central Valley under active construction and a completion date that had receded well into the future. The barriers in both countries are recognizable: fragmented land ownership requiring expensive legal processes, environmental review timelines stretching across years, a construction industry with limited recent experience in this type of project and therefore pricing it at a significant premium, and political cycles that make long-term infrastructure commitments difficult to sustain across multiple governments. Where high-speed rail does exist, its consequences are substantial and well documented. Air France dropped its Paris to Lyon service entirely after the TGV arrived, and domestic aviation on HSR-served routes across Europe has contracted significantly. Spain's AVE network has drawn investment to secondary cities and reduced regional inequality in connectivity. Japan's Tokaido Shinkansen carries more passengers than any other railway in the world and underpins the economic integration of the country's three largest metropolitan areas. The environmental case has grown more urgent as aviation's carbon footprint attracts increasing scrutiny. On a per-passenger kilometre basis, high-speed rail emits roughly 80 to 90% less carbon than a comparable flight, assuming a reasonably clean electricity grid, and as national grids decarbonize, that advantage grows further. Several European governments have begun restricting short-haul flights on routes where rail alternatives exist. France moved to ban domestic flights on routes where the equivalent train journey takes under 2.5 hours, a policy that reflects a growing recognition that the choice between flying and taking the train is not just a matter of personal preference, but of collective consequence. The economic effects extend beyond transport itself. High-speed rail stations consistently generate property development and commercial activity in surrounding areas, and cities that have gained HSR connections have, across multiple studies, shown measurable increases in productivity and economic output in subsequent years. The effect is not guaranteed and depends on broader urban conditions, but it is consistent enough to feature prominently in the investment case for every new line. The most important thing to understand about high-speed rail is the difference between a solved problem and a delivered solution. The technology has been proven across multiple continents and multiple decades. The operational and environmental arguments in its favor are robust and widely accepted by engineers, economists, and transport planners. The obstacle is not engineering. It is the structure of democratic decision-making, private land ownership, procurement systems, and political time horizons that rarely extend beyond 4 or 5 years. Countries that built their networks early, or that had the political conditions to build quickly, have infrastructure that now underpins their economies in ways that are essentially irreversible. Countries that delayed are now facing costs 2 or 3 times higher in real terms, against a political backdrop that makes long-term commitment harder than ever. The lesson is not that high-speed rail is impossible outside China and Japan. It is that the conditions that make it possible are rare, and they require protection and sustained commitment across periods of time that exceed most electoral cycles. Japan built the Shinkansen in 1964, at roughly the same moment it was rebuilding its entire post-war economy. China built its network in 15 years, at a moment of singular national focus and financial capacity. Both of those windows were unusual in historical terms, and neither of them arrived by accident. The question facing the rest of the world is whether the political will to create those conditions can be built and sustained across the decades it takes to plan, fund, and construct a network that will outlast any current government by a century or more. The trains work. The tracks are the hard part. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this content and want to see more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel.